you're going to keep getting the same play pattern, which is everybody just makes butter until one person has enough butter that they can just immediately win the game.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so there's this situation in Commander that I have been thinking a lot about.
Oh, you've been thinking about Commander?
Yes. The situation is that you have, in CEDH, this is a common thing that arises, is somebody tries to win the game, and then another player stops them from winning the game. And then, or a series of players. Multiple players sometimes help out to stop one person from winning the game.
Right.
If that person is stopped, the next player then tries to win the game, and they usually win the game. And it's because everybody has spent all of their resources on the first player trying to stop the first player from winning.
Yes.
So in CEDH, this usually looks like I'm going to present an infinite combo loop of some variety, whether it's going to get rid of my entire library or if it's going to play all the stuff from my graveyard or whatever.
Yeah.
And then everybody plays counterspells to stop that from happening. Back and forth. I might have counterspells to protect my own win, whatever.
Before we get into today's video, please, if you like the content that we're doing on this channel, give us a little like and a subscribe.
So I was trying to figure out like what this situation is called, right?
Right.
In terms of game theory, right? Where what is a word that describes that situation where you have two people, let's just say it's two. I think it could be it could be at least three people or any number beyond that. But you have,
it has to be three or more.
It has to be at least three or more. But you have two people that are in conflict and another person who is bystanding, saying, I'm not going to interfere here because I am benefiting from the conflict of these two people to the tune of once one of the two of them wins, I can then come in and win the game.
Right. This is a unique problem to Commander. I'm sure other games that exist that have this.
Free-for-all multiplayer in general.
Free-for-all multiplayer where the goal to win the game is essentially last man standing.
Right.
And if that is the objective and there's direct interaction between all other players, then this is sort of a dilemma that will arise. And we said bystander. We're kind of calling this the bystander dilemma. This might be a thing that exists already.
Well, and when we were doing research for the video, we came across the free rider problem, which is an economic theory that basically is saying that someone is benefiting from the expenditure of someone else's resources.
But in Commander...
Right. This is why it doesn't quite work in Commander, because the way that you're benefiting from the expenditure of someone else's resources, their counterspells, their removal, whatever it might be, is it's only causing sort of like a negative impact to them and their opponent, not necessarily a positive one to you.
Right.
It's sort of positive in the negative, if that makes sense.
Right.
Right. So it could be the free rider. It could be the free rider problem. But I think that the bystander dilemma, I think to me, maybe describes this a little better.
Right. And the reason that you might not see it in other games, and actually we should probably point this out, that in some games, even if there is it's last man standing, it might not exist.
Yeah.
And the reason that it might not exist in these other games that are last man standing, free-for-all multiplayer, is because you might not have the opportunity of inaction.
Right.
Which that's what is sort of creating this dilemma in Commander Magic. We're calling this a dilemma. This doesn't necessarily, it's not a positive or a negative thing. This is just something that we're recognizing as a pattern, and and it's always up to the designers on whether they want to encourage this sort of player behavior or try to curb it somehow. And Magic has tried to do that in the past.
There's been a couple attempts to encourage action.
Right, because that's all they can do. They can't force it.
It's not built into the rules set of Commander that action is required. Right. So, we can look at another type of genre that runs into similar problems here with the Battle Royale. So something like Fortnite or PUBG, where the way that they have sort of tried to fix this problem of inaction or this bystander problem is that they have this giant ring that encloses smaller and smaller and smaller over time goes on, forcing people into conflict with each other.
Right.
But it is a little strange that if everyone just decided not to shoot each other, the whole thing kind of falls apart, right? It's a little weird. So it doesn't necessarily require action. It just pushes you towards it.
Technically, the game then becomes who can survive by not being consumed by the storm first.
Right, but like if everybody, like eventually it's just...
Eventually, everyone will die. However, one person will technically be the last man standing.
Right. So the other way that it kind of incentivizes action is that it rewards players for defeating other players.
This is probably the biggest one that I think Magic has tried to lean on the most.
I guess. I think
How
there's...
have they not?
Well, okay, we're kind of having a conversation about this and how the Monarch works, how Goad works, these mechanics that Magic has tried to bring into Commander to sort of alleviate some of these problems. But it's not exactly what I'm referring to in that in Fortnite, it's like... or I guess PUBG, that's the one I've played. I've never played Fortnite. But in PUBG, when you kill somebody, you beat them or whatever, you can then go take their stuff, and it sort of theoretically gives you back hopefully more than what you expended to beat that person. Where in Magic, there's no bonus for defeating another player. Not
for defeating another player, but yes, like so Monarch is just simply you just have to hit that player. Afterwards, you don't have to interact with them at all, and you probably won't if you don't have to in order to get the benefit. Because as long as you are the Monarch, you're receiving the benefit.
Right, and I guess like I see this as like a two-sided possible issue, right? You can attack this from either side, right? You can attack the inaction side, which I think is what the Monarch is attempting to do. It's saying, if you don't do something, this player is just drawing extra cards every turn.
Right.
Which, to me, is not that straightforward, right? It's like, especially in Commander, where you're drawing tons of cards, and players are like, okay, like, I don't really... What's another card, right?
Right.
Or you can attack this from the other side, which is incentivizing the action through rewarding the player who is acting, right? Yeah. And there's actually like one card that sort of does this, and it's called Curse of Vengeance. It is 1 black mana for an enchantment aura curse, so a player aura. Enchant player. Whenever enchanted player casts a spell, put a spike counter on Curse of Vengeance. When enchanted player loses the game, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of spike counters on Curse of Vengeance.
Okay.
So that's sort of like what I'm talking about in terms of incentivizing the action of defeating another player.
Right. You don't get it until that player's gone, meaning you got to get that player out before you're out in order to gain the benefits.
And the thing that's weird about this particular scenario is, like, let's say this is the way that you wanted to handle that is by having an enchantment like this. That's only incentivizing one player to beat the other player.
It needs to incentivize all the players to be doing this.
It should be, if any player defeats that player, they get the bonuses from this enchantment.
Right.
Rather than just the one who controls the enchantment.
I think some people would be hesitant to do that, and I can already tell there's probably going to be some people that are going to be talking about what's called the snowball effect in games. And I think for people that might be concerned about, is she going to be...
Oh, hello.
Is this going to be a thing?
Every time.
Yes. I guess we're just that kind of a podcast now.
She's my cat now.
All right. So for the players that might be concerned and be like, well, then players would snowball and they'd get really strong and they'd be too strong and whatever. In a free-for-all multiplayer environment where there's asymmetry of players and there's constant, like, whether you formally make an alliance or not, you're always kind of making an alliance.
Right.
As everyone's sort of assessing the threat at the table. And so if someone ends up getting a benefit because they were the one that killed a player and removed them, that just sort of puts a target on them. Meaning that, like, yes, they technically are stronger and got a benefit, which would lead to a snowball effect. However, now that there's asymmetry at the table, it can make up for the fact that someone...
The other two can team up, right? Yeah. That makes a certain amount of sense. I think that, like, understanding... all right, cool. Understanding... this dynamic in Commander, and one thing to bring up, and that why we're sort of saying that, like, the free rider problem isn't exactly perfect here, it's that usually, like, in the real world, in quotes, is that if someone is entering into a conflict, let's say a war of some variety, they're doing so for some kind of benefit, right?
Right.
And if they win that war, they will claim territory,
Yeah.
or theoretically, or something, right? Where in Magic, there's really no incentive to enter into conflicts because you're just spending resources that doesn't really help you beat the other players in any way. It doesn't
Right.
help you gain anything.
It benefits you to be as passive as possible. If everyone else is fighting each other, just have your defenses up enough so they don't bother you, and stay out of it.
Yeah. Literally do as little as possible. This is the thing that we bring up a lot when we say the incentives of Commander are telling you to do as little as possible.
Right.
Besides, invest in your own economy, right? So there's this economic theory where they're talking about a society can either make butter or make guns, right? And so that's effectively what we're talking about in this scenario. We have our video on externalities, which is talking about why removal in Commander is not particularly good.
Yeah.
And it's because removal is only guns, right?
Yeah.
So and then on top of that, the thing that guns in the real world, in quotes, are used for, again, we're generalizing a lot here. This is mostly examples, but the idea is that it's either for protecting your own resources or acquiring someone else's resources.
Right.
And in Magic, there's no acquiring of resources with your guns.
Right.
It's sort of like if every removal spell, instead of saying destroy target thing, it says gain control of target thing.
Right.
Or
destroy target thing, take one of their lands or something.
Right. Yeah.
Something.
So, and that's just not how it works.
And now what's funny is that is technically how it works effectively in 1v1 Magic.
Right.
Again, I'm not going to be the person being like 1v1 Magic is superior to free for whatever. Okay. We're just talking about the differences here. I'll let Gavin say that. But in 1v1 Magic, the idea is that you are technically benefiting. It's not that you are gaining resources from other players, but it's that when the other player, the entire point is to overwhelm them and defeat them. Any sort of removal of their side of the field is not necessarily an acquisition of resources, but suddenly now your number of resources, or you could say the butter gun situation, your butter and your guns have risen higher than what their guns and butter might be, or whatever.
Right.
And so now you are able to defeat them. Whereas in Commander, as much as you and your other guy that you're fighting with are throwing butter and guns at each other, the other two players are like, let's just keep fucking making butter.
Right. Exactly. Right. And that's sort of where we get back to, our other video talking about how Commander changes the strategy. And we're talking about how greedy of a strategy, in quotes, Commander incentivizes, and it's just making as much butter as possible.
Yeah.
And so, really it's because there is there's no reward for guns, right? There's no reward for removal. The only reward is not losing the game if someone has a combo that's going to win, and then you still don't want to be the person who has to stop that from happening.
Right.
Right. And you're right in that 1v1 Magic gets around this because this is still a thing in 1v1 Magic in terms of leaning in a direction of defense in economy. But the player who has invested in the guns in the situation can win the game that way. Yeah. Right. But then again, right, we're looking at is a removal spell, say Swords to Plowshares, better than a lightning bolt, right? Where lightning bolt can be utilized to stop a creature, can also be aimed at a player's face to get them closer to 0, right? A lightning bolt can win the game. A Swords to Plowshares cannot.
Right.
Or can it, right? So it puts this in this weird situation, right? Where, especially in Commander, right? We're talking about a 6x increase in the amount of damage it would take to beat each opponent, right?
Yeah.
Through non-Commander damage means. All right, so what are some design sort of takeaways here? What can we learn from this sort of scenario? One, maybe if we have any ideas, if we're going to speculate, what are some ways that maybe Magic could even try to solve this problem?
So unfortunately, we've talked in past videos about how once you have a system that's developed for a game, that system's out there. Yeah. Very rarely can a system shift and change pretty drastically once the public's been associated with it. And at this point, Magic is
Oh, right.
You
Yeah.
know, Magic's not going to change.
Right. The systems level stuff in Magic doesn't change often. It has changed a little bit, but it's really just sort of, honing. It's not fundamental.
I think the way to kind of work around it is you have to incentivize certain player behaviors. And it would be either, like we're talking about, you take a lesson from Fortnite, from Battle Royales, and you kind of have to create something that forces interaction, essentially. It's forcing interaction, whether it's a sort of soft reinforcement where you're encouraging interaction of defeating the other players, or it's something that is literally forcing other players to attack each other, like a goad type mechanic. But it has to be powerful enough that players will basically want to put it in their decks all the time.
Right.
And I don't know if that's ever going to be a thing. I think they've definitely tried doing that with the Monarch and with goading, and they've upped some of these mechanics in a way that's like, this is just really good, so you should probably put it in to encourage some of that play patterns, but I'm not sure.
I think my biggest issue and the thing that I would want to see addressed, maybe not even in Magic, but just in a system in general that's trying to do a free-for-all multiplayer, is finding a way that rewards a player for beating another player, right? If I'm going to be investing my resources to defeat a player, I shouldn't be left in such a weakened state that the other players can just beat me, right?
Right.
That creates this downward spiral that we're talking about.
Yeah.
That's sort of what creates this, what we're calling, I guess, the bystander dilemma, in that if you're just incentivizing people to inaction, to be bystanders and watching other people fight it out, you're going to keep getting the same play pattern, which is everybody just makes butter until one person has enough butter that they can just immediately win the game.
Right.
So
the other way to work around this too, I mean, if you're developing your own system for a game, is you could have player elimination, but you can also swap the objective or the win condition, essentially.
Right.
It's not that you can't still have direct interaction, but that's why we have old Settlers Catan here.
Right.
Because Settlers, very similar scenario, but because you don't have this sort of player elimination situation, you still benefit from going and interacting with other players. You are gaining something and you are taking something from another player, but it doesn't necessarily, like, other players want to stop you from doing that as well.
Right, and if we look at like the way that the thief works, right, in Catan, right, it's that you move the thief and you put it on someone's spot, which denies them resources, but then you also get to steal a card from their hand, right?
Right.
And that's sort of kind of what we're talking about, right, is that there's this negative consequence of this direct interaction with a single player. It doesn't... What's the resource it uses? It's just what you rolled on your turn. Now you get to move it. Or I guess if you had a knight card,
you have a knight card. You
right.
can roll 7.
So if you're using your knight card, your resource, to then move the thief, you're then denying another player resources by blocking them off with it. But then you also get to steal a card from their hand, and that, I think, is sort of a way to bring a player back to parity. With having expended a resource of one variety, now you're gaining a resource of another.